Hey there, Crystal here from Speaking of Wildlife, and we are so excited to be joining you virtually for Aurora's Arctic Adventure. In this video, we are going to introduce you to some of Speaking of Wildlife's wildlife ambassadors that prefer to work from home. So as we travel around, we want you to keep a couple of things in mind. Speaking of Wildlife is a licensed wildlife education center that provides permanent sanctuary to non-releasable Ontario wildlife. Each of the animals that you're going to meet today or that you met in any of our programs are all with us because they cannot survive in the wild. These animals have been injured, orphaned, abandoned, illegally kept as pets, and some were born in captivity. But in all cases, these animals cannot be returned to the wild where they belong. They'll live out the rest of their days with us here, where we provide their essential needs, things like veterinary care, balanced diets, and enrichment, as well as specialized care for their individual needs, abilities, and desires. We want to make sure they get a few of their favorite things as well. Now, once these animals have come to us, they usually stay with us for the rest of their lives, and where suited, they can participate in our education programs. So today you're going to meet some of our animals that work from home. In other programs, maybe you've met some of the animals that prefer to travel, but in all cases, these guys teach you about the animals you can find in your very own backyard. So, let's get started. Let's meet some animals. First up, we've got Ocellus the bobcat. Ocellus was actually born in captivity for the purpose of the exotic pet industry. And while it's illegal here in Ontario to own native species in our homes as pets, other parts of the world don't necessarily have the same strict laws. Now, just because somebody does it somewhere does not mean it's a good idea. In fact, Ocellus was actually removed from poor conditions in a U.S. breeding facility and transferred to us where he could be cared for properly and where he could have a more natural environment to live in. Now, that breeding facility would have been more concerned with the number of bobcats they were creating over the care and welfare for those animals. So here, Ocellus can have a great life, but he can also become an ambassador for his species, for wildcats in Ontario, and also for the dangers of keeping wild animals in our homes as pets. Now, you can imagine that this guy's a bit different than the cat you might have in your home. These guys are built for life in the wild. And as a carnivore, that's of course going to include hunting. So they're going to hunt things like small mammals all the way up to something the size of a deer. And they have the strength and the abilities to do that. A little different than your house cat for sure. So they've got those sharp claws and those big teeth. They've got a lot of muscle and strength and capabilities when it comes to taking down something they might like to eat. They also have some pretty incredible senses. So they can see and they can hear pretty well to locate prey. So if we compare some of the things that our house cats do that might be funny or cute, maybe a little unnerving, to a bobcat, you might think twice about having one of them in your home. The first, of course, is something like if your cat jumps out from behind the couch and attacks your toes. You might laugh, you might think that's kind of funny, you might get away with a scratch. If a bobcat jumps out from behind the couch and attacks your toes, you might lose a toe. So all of these things combined make this an inappropriate animal to have in our home, playing with us, snuggling with us. They simply aren't meant to be house pets. Now, Ocellus might be sort of a strange name to you, but we actually chose that name for a pretty cool reason. Ocellus is the word that we would use to describe the white spots on the back of a bobcat's ears. Those white spots are meant to give the illusion that just like our mothers, bobcats have eyes on the back of their head. So if anything was sneaking up behind a bobcat and spotted those white spots, they would think the bobcat was staring back at them. And that might give them pause or make them think twice about jumping out and attacking the bobcat. It's also going to help them when they're raising their young. So mom's going to take her young out into the forest to really hone their skills. And when she does that, she might blend in pretty well with the forest background. Those white spots, however, are going to stand out. So the young will actually follow mom's white spots to know exactly where she is. They can also tell how she's feeling. She'll sort of communicate with those ears, and if those white spots or her ears are tucked back, the young know that there might be trouble. If those spots disappear altogether, the babies know they've probably strayed a little too far and should get back to mom. So it's a cool way for mom to communicate with her young while she's teaching them to use their skills or to hunt out in the wild. Now, Ocellus has become a wildlife ambassador for his species, as well as for wildcats in Ontario. There are actually 3 types of wildcats that you can find in the province. The bobcat is the smallest and lives in central or southern Ontario. The lynx, their close relative, is built with great big paws for living up in northern climates where there's lots of snow. And the largest of the 3 is the cougar, which may be spotted in some parts of Ontario as well. While all of these wild cats are truly built for life in the wild and have many characteristics that set them apart from our domestic pets, there are some that sort of overlap. That catitude is one of them. So since Ocellus has totally abandoned me and has gone off to do his own thing, let's move on to the next animal. Here we are alongside some of our small mammal enclosures. These enclosures were actually designed and built so that the animals that inhabit them can choose whether they spend their time indoors or out. Now they can come out through the door and enjoy some fresh air or experience the elements, or they can stay tucked away indoors. It's totally up to them. Now this is true in the warm summer months, but in the winter, we have to start making some decisions. We can't keep the doors open all winter long for obvious reasons, so we have to decide back in the fall whether the animals in these enclosures would prefer or would thrive indoors or out in the cold winter months. Now in some cases the animals do better outside, but in the case of this animal that's coming up next, she actually helps to make our decision for us by taking all of the substrate in her enclosure and pushing it up against the door, barricading the door shut. A pretty good indication that she would much rather be indoors than out in the winter. Now, if we look to her wild counterparts, this would be obvious because they actually prefer to be deep underground, sleeping the winter away. So we've given you a few hints. The first was that it was a small mammal. The second, that their wild counterparts are sleeping the winter away underground. The third is that this animal is a bit of a February celebrity. In fact, we have an entire day, February 2nd, dedicated to them. Have you figured out what kind of animal we're talking about? Let's head inside and find out.
Well, did you guess right? It's a groundhog. And this is Caddyshack. Now, Caddyshack came to us when she was just a baby because unfortunately she was orphaned or abandoned in the wild, and she ended up in wildlife rehabilitation. But at that time, she was the only groundhog in care. So she didn't have any friends of her own species and unfortunately became a little too used to her human caregivers and couldn't be released back to the wild. Now in Caddyshack's case, she settled in quite nicely to her role as a wildlife ambassador, and she also has a reputation around here for being a pretty good meteorologist. This means that she helps to predict or forecast the weather. At least that's what they tell us on February 2nd, Groundhog Day. Now they say that these true hibernators will come out of their burrows, and if they see their shadows, that means we'll have 6 more weeks of winter. And if they don't see the shadow, well, that means we'll have an early spring. So, what do you guys think? Look outside your windows. Are groundhogs coming up out of the ground today? It's probably a little snowy out there. It's been quite cold. I think those groundhogs are sound asleep. You see, they're true hibernators, which means in the fall they've built up all of these fat and all of this extra energy, then they've gone deep down underground below the frost line and they've fallen asleep. They're in such a deep sleep that they won't wake up again until the spring. They've buried themselves right in there. And in the spring, they'll be looking for 2 things. They'll be looking for vegetation because these guys are a herbivore, so they like to eat plants, and they'll be looking for a mate, which means other groundhogs have to be awake too. So I think the groundhogs out in the wild in Ontario right now are probably thinking, it's not quite spring yet.
Our resident meteorologist, Caddyshack the Groundhog, has made her official 2021 prediction for Groundhog Day. And here it is. Now, there's no question Caddyshack definitely saw her shadow this year, and that means 6 more weeks of winter. And while we're sad to share that news, I think we can all agree that Caddyshack did an amazing job and was pretty darn cute coming out of that log this year. All right, let's move on to meet Another wildlife ambassador. Next up, we're visiting Maverick the wolf at his home. Maverick is a full-grown, nearly 4-year-old gray wolf, and he weighs in at about 110 pounds. Now, when he first came to us, he was only 10 days old, and he weighed in at just 1 pound, so he's certainly grown a lot in the last 4 years. Now, when he first came to us, it was actually because his captive pack that he was born to was experiencing a bit of a disturbance. So unfortunately, instead of working together to raise the pups, some of the wolves were dispersing the pups throughout the enclosure and putting their lives at risk. Now, those pups wouldn't have even had their eyes open and couldn't move around on their own. So they relied on other pack members to carry them around or to retrieve them and bring them back to the den where Mom was. Because this didn't happen, the Wolf Center decided that they would need to place some of the pups in other reputable facilities to increase the survival rate of the litter and the pack overall. So Maverick came to us when he was only 10 days old and was hand-raised by myself and some of our staff. Because of this, Maverick has sort of a strange pack. Some of us are human. And because he opened his eyes to see me, he thinks that I'm his mom. And that means that he's ranked me as the alpha female. How crazy is that? I am certainly not tough enough to be the alpha female in a wolf pack, but because Maverick thinks I'm his mom, and in those wolf packs, there are only 2 breeding individuals, the alpha female and the alpha male, he thinks that I'm the alpha. Now that said, we don't interact with Maverick inside the enclosure. And the reason for this is we simply aren't built to do that safely. We don't have the tough skin or the thick fur. We don't have the incredible senses or that really strong jaw with those really sharp teeth. In fact, his jaw strength is believed to be up to 1,400 pounds per square inch of pressure. That's enough to break the femur, a very large bone in your leg, of a deer or a moose. And this is not a theory that I'd like to test out in real life. So we don't interact with Maverick inside the enclosure, and we do hope that one day we'll be able to give Maverick a companion that is his own species. So stay tuned. Maybe you'll have a companion someday soon. Now, when we're talking about wolf packs, it's a pretty unique pack or family group that actually hunts together. So these guys are out looking for small mammals, maybe even large mammals like deer or moose, and sometimes they split up to do this. Now, they'll be following their noses, and they'll be using their eyes and their ears to find their food. But what happens if one of them finds food before the others? Well, of course, they're going to communicate that to the rest of their family or their pack. And how do they do that? By howling, I'm sure you've guessed. That howl is a long-distance communication between a wolf pack. So they might howl that they have found food, they might howl that they've become lost or they got too far away from the pack. So they're indicating their location to the rest of the pack members. This howl is believed to be able to travel or to be able to be heard from like 10 kilometers away, up to 16 in large open spaces. And that's pretty incredible. Now, I'm right next to the enclosure right now, but I did want to demonstrate how well Maverick can hear and respond to that howl, if we're lucky today. And I thought maybe you guys could help me out at home. If you guys on the count of 3 want to howl as loud as you can, I'll howl too, and we'll see if we can get Maverick to howl back with us. Now, if you've got any pets in the room, you might want to keep an eye on them, or bear in mind that it can be kind of alarming to hear a wolf pack howling in your living room. So let's give it a go. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh! 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 Did you hear that? Maverick howled back with us. Now, I think he was rolling around in the snow and having a great time. Maverick is well built for the winter. He's got that thick fur and he loves the snow. When he's not rolling in it, he's usually running, chasing snowballs, or even eating the snow. I don't know that he's figured out not to eat the yellow stuff yet. In any case, he is well built for the winter. He does live outside year round. We have provided an insulated den that is straw lined, but he doesn't seem to use it all that often. He often plays on it. We've seen on the roof of it sometimes. He hides his food in it, but he prefers the den he's built himself. He's dug a hole underground that goes just below ground level so he can tuck himself away, curl up in a tight ball, and keep himself warm and sheltered from any wind or blustery weather that our winters might throw at us. In any case, we worry a lot about our animals outside in the cold, but these wild animals truly are built or adapted to living in the wild or outside throughout all of our seasons, and often Maverick's seen playing in the winter weather over hiding or sheltering from it. Anyways, he's done a fantastic job, and I think he's off running around the enclosure as we speak, so let's move on to our next guest. Lastly, we wanted to introduce you to a couple of the animals that you wouldn't have a chance to meet at Aurora's Arctic Adventure, because these animals are reptiles, and reptiles are ectothermic, which means that instead of shivering or sweating like we do to regulate our body temperatures from within, these animals have to rely on the environment to help them regulate their body temperatures. So with the winter being as cold and snowy as it is, you're not going to find many reptiles out in the wild in Ontario at this time of year. So while their wild counterparts are hibernating, our resident reptiles are enjoying the warmth of the indoors, where we keep them comfortable all winter long. So today we're going to give you an opportunity to meet 2 of the 3 types of reptiles you can find in Ontario. Do you guys think you could name the 3 different types of reptiles you can find in the province? I'll give you a couple of hints. The first is long and slithery. You got it, it's the snake. The second is a true homebody. They've got a shell on their back for protection. There it is, it's the turtles. And the third is kind of tricky. There's only 1 species of this reptile in the province. It's the 5-lined skink, which is a type of lizard. So we don't have any lizards here at the center, but we do have turtles and snakes. So today we're going to introduce you to 1 of each of those. Here we have Burnaby, the wood turtle. Burnaby came to us after she was found crossing the road in British Columbia. Now, not only was she in a dangerous place, but this species of turtle is not native to the province of BC. So she was transferred to Speaking of Wildlife so that she could educate people more about a couple of things. About the fact that this species is critically endangered here in Ontario, and because we believe that Burnaby may have been kept illegally as a pet. And there are a few things about her that indicate she wasn't cared for properly. And so we want to teach people a little bit more about turtles. This species in particular is very interesting. They spend a lot of time out on land, so they're semi-terrestrial. They like to eat things like berries and insects, and one of their favorite things is worms. Now, it's believed that these guys are so smart that they can actually mimic the sound of rain by stomping their feet on the ground to lure things like earthworms out of the ground to soak up that moisture. Now, of course, once they get to the surface, there isn't any rain at all. There's a wood turtle waiting to slurp them up like spaghetti. Now, another thing that's really cool about these guys is that they move pretty quickly on land. It's believed they can go a whopping 0.32 kilometers per hour. I bet you guys could crab walk backwards with your eyes closed faster than that. Wood turtles are also unique in their appearance. They have that shell that looks like it's been carved from wood, and they have bright orange skin. Those are the 2 key identifying features of a wood turtle. So if you ever spot one of these guys in the wild here in Ontario, you definitely want to report that sighting. Because as I mentioned before, these guys are critically endangered in this province. Now, from one species at risk to another, let's move on to meet Scales, the gray rat snake. Behind me in this enclosure is Scales, our gray rat snake, which is actually the longest species of snake you can find here in Ontario. And actually, he's a pretty good representation, measuring in at close to 2 meters already. Now, this snake is what we would call arboreal, so they spend a lot of their time up in the trees, like he's demonstrating. So not only will they eat rats like their name suggests, but they'll also eat birds and small mammals that they might find in the trees. Now, to hunt those animals, they're going to use their tongue for smelling. They're going to feel vibrations to know where that animal is headed. And then they're going to sneak up on it, reach out, grab on, and wrap their bodies around it, squeezing it until it stops moving so they can swallow it whole in one big piece. Now, if you're not a big fan of snakes, you don't have to worry too much about finding one of these guys in your backyard because unfortunately, there are species at risk with only 2 populations left in the province, one in the Niagara region and one in Kingston. So if you're out hiking in those areas and you spot one, quite a lucky sighting. But outside of those areas, you're probably not going to find one in your backyard.
And just like that, this video program is all wrapped up.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn a little bit more about Speaking of Wildlife, feel free to check us out on Facebook or Instagram or at speakingofwildlife.ca. And until next time, take care.